What's the next thing you want to know?
Yeah. So yeah, that was super helpful. So I want to know, how would you market individual podcast episodes in specific local cities or states? And like, we're a national, international station, but I think there's specific shows where you want to try to market more locally. And I'd love some advice on that.
Cool. Give me an example of a show that you would want to market locally and why locally.
So, for instance, I actually host a podcast called Say Their Name, where I go around the country. I literally drove around the country during our road trip, interviewing families impacted by police violence. And so these stories are very much rooted in their local cities and their local states. And they're stories that a lot of people are familiar with in those areas and would love to learn more. So we went to Sacramento and interviewed Stephon Clark's family. So how could we market locally in Sacramento about this story where this person was killed, I believe it was about 4 or 5 years ago in the city of Sacramento, and reaching people there?
Okay. So a few things. So first is when you pick the city, so let's take that as an example, right? Let's say it's Sacramento. So the first thing I would do is I would look for local influencers. And I don't mean influencer like bikini chick on Instagram. I mean, it's funny. I always say like most quote unquote influencers don't actually have any influence. So I mean people that are actually influencing things. So whether that be local bloggers, podcasters, newsletters, journalists, who are the people on a local level that have those audiences, right? I would find them to start by making them aware that this thing exists and hoping that you can get some of them to share it, right? You want to find your connections to those local communities. Yeah. Reach out, make sure those people are aware of it. The next thing is, if you're going to do some paid promotion, obviously Facebook ads or Google ads or whatever you're going to do can be locally targeted. If you do that, again, you want to make your messaging local. So you want to reference Sacramento or whatever it is. The other thing is, if you're using images, use local images, right?
What do you mean by that?
So what I mean is, if let's say you're targeting, and I don't know Sacramento well, but let's say you're targeting Sacramento, the obvious image might be to just be your show title or an image of the host or an image of the person maybe who is a victim of violence or whatever it is. You'll do better if you're targeting people in Sacramento with an image of something in Sacramento, because when people are flying by their feeds, they go, oh, that's my neighborhood, right?
Okay.
That's my thing. Versus they may not know who that person is or what it looks like. So when you can show people something that's familiar, again, you would test this, but typically it's a way on a local level, people assume it's more relevant to them. So they sort of stop and look at it, right? Same thing with your headline. Like your headline you wouldn't run a headline that's about police violence or whatever it is. You would specifically say violence in Sacramento. Like you want people to know this is about this thing locally. The other thing is, and you're kind of doing this in this example, but if it was something else, like incorporate something into the episode that is local. And then also you could add, let's say you did I'm going to give you a totally different example.
Okay.
Well, actually, no, we'll use this one. Let's say it was an episode about violence. And let's say it wasn't about a specific person or specific case or whatever, that it was a general episode about violence in inner cities, making this up, right? That episode may not be about Sacramento or Chicago or whatever, but it might be relevant there and you might want to promote it. So you might record that episode and it's a general episode about inner city violence. Then take that episode and create a blog post, and in the blog post, add a local angle. So the blog post becomes, we did this episode about inner city violence. Did you know X, Y, and Z about inner city violence in Chicago? So the podcast episode is universal or national or whatever, but the blog post is now local.
Yeah.
If you do that, you're then able to market the blog post specifically about violence in Chicago, which draws them in and introduces them to the general violence episode.
Yeah.
You can then go a step further. This is where it starts to combine stuff. And now that blog post is what you're asking all those local influencers to share and or contribute to. So now you reach out to, let's say, the local influencer in Chicago and say, hey, we did an episode about inner city violence. We're writing a blog post about inner city violence in Chicago. You're on the ground, you're on the front lines. We'd love to hear your thoughts. We'd love to include a quote from you. We'd love to link to an episode you did of your show or an issue of your newsletter that talks about this. We're creating a sort of Chicago violence post. So they go, oh, sure, I have a lot of thoughts about this. I just did a whole episode about that. Okay, we'll include it. Now they're way more likely to share it.
Yeah.
What's interesting is once you sort of do this format and sort of crack the formula, you can repeat that with as many cities as you want. So one episode that's a general episode about inner city violence, you might go to 10 different cities and have the Chicago blog post that has that embedded, the New York blog post that has it embedded, the San Francisco blog post that has it embedded. You've reached out to the influencers and incorporated them. And now you've got an army of people sharing, and it's still your one episode, but you've just localized it around it. You can see how massively that would increase your attention to your episode and your podcast and everything else, and make that outreach easier and get people sort of invested in the thing. And you become a part of the conversation in all these different cities. So there's sort of two pieces there, right? One is it's a local episode, so it makes sense anyway. The other is here's how I take a non-local episode and make it local, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, all makes sense. I really like those. Yeah, we're going to definitely jump on that as we get into the next season.
Cool. Yeah. And I think, again, the thing to keep in the back of your mind, especially when it comes to local, is you pick a city and you're experimenting. You're looking to, like what I say is like crack the code. Because if it works in one city, it'll work in every city. So the experimentation part is, let me figure out, can I take this episode where maybe, again, I'm talking if it's a more general episode, but can I take this episode and figure out a way to make this a thing in this market?
Yeah.
And if I can do that, the exact same thing will work in other markets. And I think what's really interesting in terms of a scalability is once you crack that code, you could actually hire someone or have someone who works for you and go, hey, I want you to take each episode and I want you to market it in these 10 or 15 or 20 cities or 5 cities or whatever it is. Here's step-by-step how you do it. You find these influencers, you reach out to them, et cetera. So yes, it's not as easy as like, oh, we just made an episode and we send a bunch of emails and whatever, but it could be really effective, especially with what you're doing. And if you can sort of figure out what the formula is.
Oh yeah, I already was thinking putting my assistant on that one right now.
Yeah, there you go. When in doubt. Cool.